In 1985, a young man from a quiet American town set out for a simple adventure, just another day, exploring a local cave. But he never came back. No one could explain it. No body, no clues, no answers. He vanished completely without a trace. A full year later, when hope had all but faded, something was discovered. Something so shocking, so unsettling, that it left the entire town in disbelief. A passing man saw it, a hand lifeless emerging from solid rock. What happened inside that cave? Why couldn't anyone save him? And how could someone disappear into the earth itself, never to return? This is not just the story of a disappearance. It's the story of a family broken by loss, a town haunted by questions, and a mystery that nature itself refused to reveal. Stay with us, because once you hear what happened, you'll never forget it. And you'll find yourself asking, what would you do if it happened to someone you love? It was the morning of April 12, 1985, in the quiet town of St. Joseph, Utah. The sun was just beginning to warm the chilly air as Ethan Miller, a 27-year-old local, finished tying the laces on his worn hiking boots. His mother, Margaret, stood by the doorway, watching him with a mixture of pride and quiet worry. "You've got everything?" she asked softly. Her arms crossed over her apron. Ethan smiled, adjusting the small backpack on his shoulder. "Got my flashlight, water, rope, and the old map. I'll be back by sunset." He was the kind of man who found beauty where others saw only dust and rocks. Since childhood, Ethan had loved exploring the natural world, especially the rugged hills and hidden caves surrounding their town. The cave he planned to visit today, known locally as Stonehall Cave, wasn't particularly famous. In fact, most people in St. Joseph barely spoke of it. But for Ethan, it was one more adventure before the real-world work. Responsibilities tightened its grip on him. His father, Robert Miller, stood silently by the family truck, squinting at the horizon. He gave Ethan a brief nod. The two men shared few words, but the bond between them was strong in its simplicity. "Be careful," Robert finally muttered. Ethan's younger sister, Emily, 19 years old and home from college for the weekend, appeared at the window. She gave him a playful salute. "Don't get lost in there, Indiana Jones." He laughed. "I'll be back in time for dinner." No one could have known those would be the last words they'd hear from him. By midday, Ethan's truck was found parked near the base of the hills. He had written his name and the time on a small chalkboard nailed near the entrance of the cavea, common practice among local hikers to let others know who was inside. The wind blew steadily through the rocky outcrops. The cave entrance, dark and uninviting, swallowed the light as Ethan stepped inside. Hours passed. Sunset came and went. At first, the family wasn't too concerned. Ethan was known to lose track of time, caught up in the beauty of nature. But as midnight approached, Margaret stood at the window, her hands trembling around a cold cup of tea. The truck was still missing. The lights in his room stayed off. By dawn, the fear had settled in deep, and so began the longest wait of their lives. The morning after Ethan failed to return, the Miller household was thick with quiet dread. The sun had barely risen, yet Margaret had been awake all night, pacing the floor, glancing through the window every few minutes, as if expecting to see Ethan walking up the gravel path, waving casually like nothing had happened. But the path remained empty. By 7 a.m., Robert Miller decided to drive up to the hills himself. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but Margaret could see the tightness in his jaw as he grabbed his keys. Emily, still in her pajamas, stood on the porch, hugging herself against the morning chill, her eyes filled with silent fear. The drive to Stonehall Cave was short, no more than 15 minutes. Robert knew every curve of the dirt road, every ridge of those hills. When he arrived, his heart sank. Ethan's old blue Chevrolet pickup sat exactly where they thought it would, parked neatly off to the side. untouched. Robert honked the horn twice. Waited. Nothing. He called his son's name, his voice echoing against the rocky cliffs. The only reply was the cold whisper of the wind. The entrance to the cave loomed dark and still, the worn chalkboard by the mouth of the cave bearing Ethan's familiar handwriting. E. Miller entered 11:42 a.m. No out time. Robert didn't have to say a word when he returned home. The look on his face said everything. By noon, the St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department had been called. A few deputies, along with a handful of local volunteers, arrived at the site. They were cautious small-town law enforcement wasn't equipped for complex cave rescues. They brought ropes, lights, and basic equipment. But none of them were professional cavers. The search inside Stonehall Cave began. The cave was narrow, colder than expected, with tight passages that twisted and dropped unpredictably. Volunteers shouted Ethan's name into the darkness. Some pushed deeper. Others scanned for footprints or signs of movement. Hours passed. Nothing. Margaret, Emily, and Robert sat together on the porch as the sun went down, watching the dirt road where the search team would eventually reappear. The waiting was unbearable. Emily held her mother's hand, her thumb brushing over her trembling knuckles. When the sheriff's car finally pulled into the driveway, the look on the officer's face was grim but measured. "We didn't find him," he said quietly. "We'll continue at first light. We're bringing in better equipment. We're not giving up." But in the deepest part of their hearts, the Millers felt something cold settle a quiet, unspeakable terror that perhaps Ethan wasn't just missing, perhaps he was truly gone. By the third day, the small town of St. Joseph was buzzing with quiet concern. Missing person posters with Ethan Miller's faces smiling, casual, full of life were hastily printed and taped onto shop windows, gas station doors, and community bulletin boards. His name was on everyone's lips, but no one had answers. The Utah Search and Rescue Team had now joined the effort, bringing with them specialized caving experts, equipment, and high-powered lights. The Stonehall Cave, once just another forgotten landmark in the rugged hills, had become the center of a growing mystery. The rescue teams mapped the cave carefully. Every twist, every turn, every narrow passage was explored. They found signs that Ethan had gone in deep. A discarded water bottle, faint fingerprints on the dusty limestone walls, and a small mark made in chalcone of the standard safety signals explorers used to mark their path. But the cave suddenly narrowed beyond a certain point, shrinking into tight, almost impossible to navigate passageways. The rescuers could only crawl forward, inch by inch. Some of the openings were so narrow that only the slimmest bodies could pass through. They pushed as far as they could. No sign of Ethan, no backpack, no flashlight, no voice answering their shouts. It was as if the cave had swallowed him whole. Back at the Miller home, the atmosphere was heavy with silent despair. Margaret sat in the living room, motionless, clutching a photograph of Ethan when he was a child. The tea on the table in front of her had gone cold. The curtains remained half-drawn. The world outside continued. Cars drove by. Birds sang, but inside, time seemed to have stopped. Robert, never a man of many words, began to show cracks in his stoicism. He barely spoke, instead spending hours sitting on the porch, staring toward the distant hills, his fingers nervously twisting his wedding ring. Emily tried to hold herself together. She made tea, she cleaned, she answered the phone when neighbors called. But every time the phone rang, her heart jolted. Every time headlights passed their window, her breath caught. The sheriff held a meeting at the small town hall for concerned citizens. He explained that, so far, there were no signs of foul play, no indication Ethan had met with violence or harm from another person. The cave was treacherous, yes, but dozens of people had explored parts of it over the years without incident. "We're not giving up," the sheriff promised. "But caves like this can be deceptive. They can twist, they can hide. Sometimes nature keeps its secrets longer than we'd like." It wasn't the kind of reassurance anyone hoped for. In a place as small as St. Joseph, everyone knew the Millers. Neighbors began bringing over casseroles, fresh bread, and offers of help. Some offered prayers. Others helped hang posters. But despite the kindness, the unspoken thought was the same in every pair of eyes. How could someone disappear without a single trace? As the third day faded into night, the Millers faced a truth they could no longer avoid. Ethan wasn't just missing. He was gone. But where? And how? The days turned into weeks. The official search for Ethan Miller gradually shifted from rescue to recovery. Despite the best efforts of cave rescue teams, geologists, and even volunteer spelunkers from other states, Stone Hall Cave refused to give up its secret. The rescue crews had mapped every accessible inch of the cave. Specialized cameras were lowered into tight crevices. Scent-tracking dogs were brought in. No signs of Ethan's body, clothing, or equipment ever surfaced. The lead search coordinator finally stood before the Miller family on a chilly Sunday afternoon. He looked exhausted, his voice soft but firm. "We've done everything we can," he said, his eyes downcast. "At this point, it's likely he entered a section too narrow for us to reach. We can't go any deeper without risking more lives." It wasn't an answer. It wasn't closure, but it was all they had. Back at home, the Miller family unraveled in quiet, devastating ways. Margaret Miller barely spoke. She moved through the house, as if in a daze, sometimes wandering into Ethan's room and sitting for hours, staring at the untouched bed, the books on the shelf, the worn hiking boots by the door. She stopped attending church. She stopped cooking. Some days, she barely ate. Robert Miller took to driving aimlessly through the countryside, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. He blamed himself but never said it aloud. He replayed their last conversation, over and over in his mind, haunted by its ordinariness. "Be careful," he had said. That was all. That was the last thing. Emily Miller tried to hold the pieces together. She kept busy laundry, groceries, calling relatives, but inside she felt like she was drowning. Her brother had always been her protector, the one who made her laugh when things were heavy at home. Now she woke in the middle of the night from dreams of caves and darkness. The town of St. Joseph did what small towns do. It moved on, slowly, gently. People stopped talking as much about Ethan. The posters faded, peeled away by wind and rain. New headlines took over. But for the Millers, life stood still. They still left the porch light on every night, just in case. The weight of the unknown. The worst part wasn't the grief. The worst part was not knowing. If Ethan had died, there would have been a funeral, a grave, a goodbye. But there was nothing. No proof. No remains. Only an endless silence. Some nights Margaret swore she could still hear the sound of the back door opening. Some nights Robert would sit on the porch until dawn, staring at the hills, convinced he'd catch some glimpsey sign that his son was still out there. And Emily? Emily wrote in her journal, "I don't think I believe in happy endings anymore." The season shifted quietly over St. Joseph, and before the Millers could truly understand how, a full year had passed since Ethan disappeared. Spring returned bright and indifferent. The same wildflowers bloomed on the hills where he had last walked. The same winds stirred the dust near Stone Hall Cave, as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened. For the Miller family, time became something different. An endless loop of waiting without purpose, hoping without reason. By now, friends and neighbors spoke less and less of Ethan. The casseroles stopped. The phone calls became rare. Life in the town moved forward in gentle but inevitable ways. But inside the Miller household, the grief remained frozen. Margaret barely left the house. She had taken to writing Ethan letters she would never send, pages filled with everyday thoughts, old memories, and quiet apologies. She folded them neatly and placed them in a shoebox under his bed. Robert worked longer hours in his carpentry shop, but his hands, steady and strong, began to tremble. He still refused to speak openly about Ethan. Some days, he would disappear for hours without explanation, only to return with red eyes and the smell of pine wood on his clothes. Emily, now 20, returned to college but visited home every weekend. She never admitted it, but she dreaded those visits. The silence in the house felt suffocating. The memories were too loud. Ethan's room remained untouched. The bed, the old backpack, the half-finished novel on the nightstand all stood exactly as he had left them. Sometimes Margaret would sit in the doorway, unable to cross the threshold, as if the room itself had become sacred ground. Robert, by contrast, never entered it. Not once. And Emily? She sat in there only once, alone, on the anniversary night. She ran her fingers over the worn flannel of Ethan's favorite jacket, her eyes brimming with tears she didn't know how to release. In town, some still whispered theories. He probably ran off. People do that, you know. Maybe he wanted to disappear. Could have been an accident. Or animals. But no one said these things directly to the Millers. And no one could explain the strangest part. There had been no signs of Ethan anywhere Elseno sightings. No credit card use. No calls. He had vanished as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. Every now and then, hikers still passed near Stonehall Cave, but many locals began to avoid it altogether. Some called it the Miller Cave now, a quiet nickname that carried both sorrow and superstition. The sheriff's office had long since closed the case as unsolved, but the Millers never did. They still left his porch light on, still waited, still listened for footsteps that never came. It was almost exactly 1 year later, April 9, 1986, when everything changed. The day had begun like any other. The sky above St. Joseph was clear, the sun bright, the wind mild. The Miller family had settled into a quiet routine of silent acceptance. The town, too, had moved on, but Dean Harper, a retired railroad worker in his 50s, had decided to take his usual morning walk along the base of the hills, near Stonehall Cave something he'd done for years without a second thought. The cave, though tied to local tragedy, had become little more than part of the landscape to most people. That morning, however, Dean saw something that stopped him cold. As he neared the weathered limestone of the hill, his eyes caught something unnatural protruding from a narrow gap in the rocks. A human hand, pale, motionless, and impossibly wedged between two slabs of stone. At first, he froze, thinking it might be an illusion, or worse, a cruel prank. But as he stepped closer, his stomach turned. The hand, dust-covered and thin, was real. Lifeless. Stuck. Dean didn't touch it. He didn't shout. He simply turned and ran faster than his legs had moved in Yearsall, the way back to the nearest gas station, where he breathlessly called the police. News of the discovery spread through St. Joseph like wildfire. The Millers received the call mid-afternoon. Margaret dropped the phone when she heard the words. Robert remained stone-faced, but the color drained from his skin. Emily, sitting silently on the front steps, broke into tears without saying a word. They all knew, even before anyone confirmed it. They knew, within hours, the sheriff's department, search teams, and forensic experts gathered near Stonehall Cave. The area was cordoned off. Reporters from Salt Lake City arrived before nightfall. The hand was indeed human, mummified by the dry air, partially fossilized by time. The position of the limb suggested it belonged to someone trapped in an impossibly narrow fissure, deep within the rock. Only a small portion of the hand had somehow found its way to the surface through a hairline crack in the mountain. Initial observations left no doubt. The hand belonged to Ethan Miller. The Millers were brought to the site under police escort. They weren't shown the hand. The sheriff thought it best. Instead, they were sat down, gently but firmly informed. Ethan's body was still trapped deep within the cave system. The possibility of recovery bringing him home was minimal to none. The rock formation was too dangerous, the passage too tight. Attempting to extract the remains could risk a collapse of the surrounding area. The family listened without interrupting. Margaret wept silently, her hand over her mouth. Robert closed his eyes and nodded once. Emily sat still, her heart shattering, but she said only 2 words. "Are you sure?" The town mourned again, quietly. A memorial was placed near the cave's entrance here. Simple wooden cross with Ethan's name carved into it by his father's own hands. The cave was officially sealed by authorities to prevent further accidents. For the Millers, it wasn't the ending they had prayed for, but it was an ending. At last, they knew. The following weeks felt surreal for the Miller family. For so long, Ethan had been missing without a trace, a question without an answer. Now, there was an answer, but no solution. The search and rescue teams, alongside structural engineers and cave experts, examined the site for days. They used ground-penetrating radar, small robotic cameras, and 3D mapping equipment to assess the narrow fissure where Ethan's hand had appeared. The results were crushing. The passage Ethan had entered was unnavigable, too tight for even the slimmest person. His body appeared to be wedged deep inside a vertical chute, a natural rock formation that spiraled down into a dead end. Any attempt to break the surrounding rock could trigger a collapse, not only destroying the fragile remains, but potentially destabilizing the entire hillside. There was no way in and no way out. The sheriff met the Millers again, this time with engineers and state officials by his side. He spoke gently, but the message was clear. There is no safe way to recover Ethan's remains. The risk is too great. I'm truly sorry. The news hit each member of the Miller family differently. Margaret fell into a quiet, resigned grief. She no longer cried openly, but moved through the house as if in slow motion. She began lighting a small candle every night by Ethan's photographer ritual that seemed to bring her a sliver of peace. Robert took to his workshop. Day after day, he carved wood, frames, crosses, small animal figures. He barely spoke. Emily sometimes found him staring at nothing for hours. Emily oscillated between anger and heartbreak. She spent hours researching cave rescue stories from around the world, desperate for some miracle, some precedent. But the facts remained the same. Her brother was gone, and they could not bring him home. The town of St. Joseph responded with the quiet respect small towns are known for. A handful of neighbors gathered at the edge of the cave one Sunday morning for a simple prayer service. No reporters, no spectacle, just silence, hands held, and whispered prayers. For the family, the most haunting question remained. Why? Why had Ethan crawled into a passage so narrow? What was he looking for? Had he mistaken the way? Had panic driven him deeper instead of back? No one would ever know. The sheriff suggested it might have been disorientation, a common risk in underground environments. A wrong turn, a false sense of direction, or perhaps a desire to push boundaries, unaware of the cave's lethal traps. A simple wooden plaque was placed near the entrance of Stonehall Cave, engraved with careful, loving words, in memory of Ethan James Miller, 1958. 1985. Loved, missed, never forgotten. The cave was sealed, and with it, a painful chapter in the Miller family's life. Or so they hoped. Weeks turned into months, but the image of Ethan's trapped hand, lifeless and forever frozen in stone, haunted the Miller family relentlessly. The discovery had not brought them closure, it had only sharpened the edges of their grief. There was no body to bury, no final goodbye, only absence. Margaret Miller spent her days in near silence. The once vibrant woman who filled the house with the smell of baking bread and the sound of old records seemed to fade into herself. She stopped attending church. She declined visits from friends. She would sit for hours on the front porch, staring toward the hills, sometimes whispering Ethan's name under her breath. She kept Ethan's room exactly as it was, the bed neatly made, the books gathering dust, the half-drunk bottle of soda still standing on the windowsill. Some nights she would leave the bedroom door open, as if expecting him to walk through it at any moment. Her world had paused, frozen in the last moment he walked out the door. Robert Miller dealt with the loss in his own quiet way. He poured himself into his woodworking. Each carved figure, each polished edge, each swing of the hammer became a silent expression of the grief he refused to voice. He rarely spoke of Ethan. He refused to look at the sealed cave when driving past it. Sometimes, Margaret would find him asleep in the workshop, his hands still stained with sawdust, the lights still burning. What he could not say, he carved into wood. For Emily Miller, the pain came in waves grief, mingled with helplessness and anger. She returned to college, but her heart wasn't in it. She stopped painting, a hobby she once loved. She visited home every weekend, unwilling to let her parents bear the weight alone. She couldn't shake the thought, why did he go in there alone? Why didn't I stop him? One evening, sitting alone on the porch, Emily wrote in her journal, "The hardest part isn't that he's gone. The hardest part is that he's still there, just out of reach, forever out of reach." In late autumn, the sheriff paid the family one last visit. He sat with them, his hat in his hands, his words careful. He spoke of the official closure of the case. There would be no further investigations, no further searches. The file would remain open, but no new actions would be taken. Sometimes nature just doesn't give answers, he said softly. "I'm so sorry." The Millers nodded. They understood. There was nothing left to say. As winter approached, small shifts began. Margaret baked bread again. Once, Robert attended a Sunday service after months away. Emily began painting just one small canvas, a picture of the hills at sunset. They carried the weight, but somehow, they kept moving. The memory of Ethan would never leave them. But slowly, quietly, they learned to live beside the sorrow. Spring returned to St. Joseph, carrying with it the same soft winds and golden sunlight that had once filled the hills on the last day Ethan walked into the cave. But for the Miller family, the seasons had lost their meaning. The days came and went in gentle repetition, each one colored by the same quiet sadness that never fully lifted. Margaret still lit a candle every evening. It had become a ritual so deeply woven into her life that she no longer thought about it. It was as natural as breathing. Some evenings, she would sit alone in Ethan's room, hands folded on her lap, eyes tracing the dust that gathered on his books and the small drawings he had tacked to the walls years before. Robert spent more time outside. He had started to take long, silent walks along the outskirts of town. Sometimes he ended up near the hills. Sometimes he didn't. He never spoke about where he went, and no one asked. His workshop remained busy, and though he carved less often, he built again small furniture, wooden toys, birdhouses. The work steadied him, gave him something to hold on to. Emily visited every weekend without fail. She had grown quieter, but also more observant. She noticed how her mother's hands trembled slightly when she poured tea. She noticed how her father's eyes always drifted toward the horizon, as if expecting something, though they all knew nothing would come. Emily painted more now, sometimes sitting in the garden for hours, without speaking, capturing the way the light moved across the sky. Her paintings were different, calm, muted, full of open space. The cave itself had become something almost mythic in the town. No one went near it. The wooden memorial near the entrance remained untouched, a silent witness to the weight of loss. Children whispered about it in hushed voices, and the story of Ethan Miller became part of the town's quiet history, spoken of rarely, but never entirely forgotten. For the Miller family, life was not about moving on. It was about learning how to live alongside the grief, how to let it exist without consuming everything. They never stopped missing him. They never stopped thinking of him. But they found, in small and gentle ways, the strength to keep living. Margaret planted flowers again, that spring tiny blue ones that Ethan used to pick for her when he was a boy. Robert joined the neighbors for coffee one morning and smiled, just slightly, when someone told a joke. Emily framed one of her new paintings and gave it to her parents without a word. None of it erased the loss, but it made the days softer. And so the Millers carried on, one quiet day at a time. As the months passed, the weight of Ethan's absence settled into something quieter, something that no longer pressed on the family's chest every waking moment, but lived beneath the surface of their lives, always there, always waiting. Margaret found herself waking earlier than before. The house, in the soft light of dawn, felt less heavy somehow. She began baking again, small loaves of bread, pies with berries from the market. She didn't do it for any particular reason. She did it because life had to be filled with something. On some mornings, she caught herself humming small, broken melodies that faded as soon as she noticed them. Robert changed in ways that were harder to see but deeply felt. He still wasn't a man of many words, but when he did speak, there was a softness that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, without prompting, he fixed the old fence behind the house, the one Ethan used to lean against on summer nights. He never said why he did it, but Margaret and Emily knew. Emily balanced two worlds. During the week, she moved through college classes, surrounded by people who had no idea what her family had endured. On weekends, she stepped back into the quiet of her parents' home, where every object, every shadow, still carried traces of Ethan. She spoke more often with her father now. They shared long silences on the porch, sometimes without exchanging a single word. Yet something unspoken passed between them, something gentle. The sealed cave remained untouched. The wildflowers grew around it. The plaque bearing Ethan's name slowly weathered under the sun and wind, but no one disturbed it. The townspeople of St. Joseph carried the story of Ethan, the way they carried their own memories of hard winters and good harvests. It became part of the landscape. One Sunday, as they gathered for a quiet lunch, Margaret placed a framed photograph of Ethan on the dining table. No one commented on it. They ate. They laughed softly at one of Emily's stories. They sipped tea. The photo stood there not as a ghost, but as something real, something still part of the family. For the first time in a long while, the house felt a little lighter. The loss was still there, deep and endless. But so was love, so was memory, and so was the quiet determination to keep living. The 1-year anniversary of Ethan's discovery arrived with little fanfare. There was no formal memorial, no gathering of neighbors, no speeches. The Miller family spent the day quietly, as they had spent so many others together, without the need for many words. The house had changed in subtle ways. Margaret kept fresh flowers on the windowsill now. Robert had built a small wooden bench in the backyard, overlooking the hills where the sun dipped each evening. Emily had framed 3 of her landscape paintings and hung them in the living room. Life was still marked by absence, but it was no longer defined entirely by it. That afternoon, they decided without planning or discussion to visit the place one last time. The 3 of them drove together, the old truck winding up the familiar dirt road. The hills were green with spring, the air soft and cool. The sealed entrance to the cave still stood where it always had, quiet and untouched. The wooden cross remained, its edges worn by time, but still standing firm. They didn't speak much as they stood there. Margaret placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the plaque. Robert, with rough hands, brushed some dust from the carved letters. Emily stood with her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the hills. They stayed for a long while. It wasn't closure in the way people often imagine. It wasn't a moment of release or sudden healing. But there was something steady in that shared silence, something unspoken but understood. Ethan would always be part of them, not only in memory, but in every breath of this land they called home. The drive back was quiet but peaceful. The air smelled of pine. The sky glowed with the soft gold of early evening. That night, Margaret lit the candle again, as she always did. But this time, when she blew it out before bed, she whispered goodnight with a small, tired smile. The Miller family would never forget, but they would live